In this video, I share a script I created to automatically start and stop Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts using Azure Automation. Hello, I'm Travis and this is Seraltos. In this video, I demonstrate a script I created that automatically starts and stops session hosts in a Windows Virtual Desktop host pool based on the number of user sessions. Before that, please take a second to subscribe and click the bell icon for new content. If you enjoy this video, please also click the thumbs up. This all helps to support my channel. Okay, let's get down to it. Microsoft already has a script published that automatically starts and stops session hosts. I took a look at it and it's similar to a script used to start and stop session hosts in an on-premises RDS environment. There are a lot of options in that script, and with those options comes complexity. It also requires a server to run as a scheduled task, not a great option for a cloud-based solution. I suspect Microsoft will have a better option eventually. Until then, I set out to create a script with the goal of saving money by bringing session hosts online when demand increases and shuts them down when server load decreases. This video gives an overview of that script and a walkthrough on how to implement it. Here are some considerations that went into making this script. The goal is to save money, and the best way to do that in Windows Virtual Desktop is with depth-first load balancing. If you're not familiar with the two options of depth-first and breadth-first load balancing, see my video on the subject. I'll have a link up there. Depth-first requires a maximum session per host setting. Make sure that this is sized appropriately for the environment to give the end users the best user experience. The previously mentioned Microsoft script had an option to run as a service principal or with a user account. The script I created uses a service principal only. The service principal also starts and stops the VMs in the host pool. It needs contributor rights to the session host resource groups to do so. Not familiar with using a service principal for deploying a Windows Virtual Desktop? I have a video for that. The script will only work with one host pool. If you have multiple host pools, you'll have to do multiple versions of the script and multiple runbooks in Azure Automation. The script will start and stop existing session hosts only. It won't provision new session hosts. The script will not factor in session hosts that are set to do not allow new connections. These will not be started or stopped. The script will only start or stop one server per run. If multiple servers need to be shut down, for example, that will take place one at a time each run. Let's move on to the logic. The logic is fairly simple and requires three pieces of information. First, the number of active sessions in the pool. Next, it needs the threshold value. This is the spare capacity, the amount of sessions that should be available between each run of the script. Next is the maximum number of sessions per session host. This number is the maximum session host value used when configuring the depth-first load balancing. The number of servers that should be running is found by adding the number of active sessions to the threshold value. That number is divided by the maximum sessions per session host. Any remainder is rounded up because you can't start a fraction of a server, at least not yet. So if there are 24 active sessions and the threshold is 8, with 16 maximum sessions per host, the total number of servers that should be running is 2. Let's say one more user signs in. Now the number of active sessions is 25, leaving 7 available session hosts, one less than our threshold. The script will detect that and start another server. Likewise, if the user logs out, the total number of active sessions goes back to 24. The script will detect that, and if no active sessions are on that third server, it'll be shut down. I added logic for peak hours. This is a time range, time zone, and day of the week we define as peak. This provides a more aggressive threshold for times of high activity. Say we wanted to keep one extra server running during peak time in the previous example. We could set the threshold during peak time from 8 to 17, one more than the max connection value. That would cause an extra server to run during the peak time. Here are some things needed to prepare for the deployment. Set a group policy to log out disconnected and idle sessions and apply it to the session host. This option is not available in Windows Virtual Desktop, and without it, disconnected sessions will linger indefinitely, and those servers will not be shut down because they'll have an active session. I tried to write this for Azure Functions, but the Windows Virtual Desktop PowerShell module requires PowerShell 5. I do leverage Azure Functions in another way, however, more to come on that. I have a whole playlist on Azure Automation if you need help with this. I also walk through setting this up in this video. 3 PowerShell modules need to be installed in Azure Automation. Newly deployed Azure Automation accounts come with the Azure RM module. This script needs the AZ module added to work. As already stated, the Windows Virtual Desktop host pool needs to be deployed with the service principal, and that service principal needs contributor rights to the Azure resource group to start and stop the VMs. A credential object is used in Azure Automation with a service principal, application ID, and password to safely store and reference the credentials. And this is my least favorite part of the solution. Azure Automation schedules have a minimum reoccurrence of 1 hour. That's not frequent enough for the script, so I use an Azure Function scheduled to run every 5 minutes to trigger the Azure Automation Runbook with a webhook. Before we move on to the demo, I have one more thing. Please test the script before you trust it. I tested the script in a smaller environment and it functioned as expected, but my testing resources are limited. All right, everyone, let's start this demo. So the first thing I'm going to do is come into my group policy. I'll create a new group policy, and I'm going to come into computer configuration policies, administrative templates, Windows components, and let's go all the way down here. Remote desktop services, remote desktop session host, and session time limits. Here there's a few settings. I have set the time limit for disconnected sessions. If I go in there, it's set to 5 minutes. That may be a little aggressive for production, but for test it's working. There's also a set time limit for active but idle remote desktop sessions. You want these set, otherwise if somebody just closes out their session without logging out, they'll disconnect, but it'll stay disconnected indefinitely, and it'll show as active and the server won't get shut down. Also, setting the idle time limit is probably a good idea. That way if somebody walks away from their computer at the end of the day but doesn't sign off, this will log them off automatically. As I think I mentioned before, this is something that you could set within remote desktop services. It's not an option in Windows Virtual Desktop. So this is the best place to set it. So set this up and make sure it's applied to the OU that the session hosts are in Active Directory. Next, we're going to create the Azure Automation account. So you can do that by simply going into Create Resources and type in Automation. There it is. And Create. And here, give it a name, select your subscription. You can create a new resource group. Set the location, and you can leave this set to yes, so it creates the run as accounts in case you need them later. If you already have an Azure Automation account, you can use that. You don't have to create a new one for this. The thing to keep in mind is I'm using the AZ PowerShell modules, and Azure Automation comes with the Azure RM modules by default. So if you do decide to use this script in an existing automation account, make sure you set it up to use the AZ modules. Microsoft recommends not to mix those, so you should either use all AZ or all RM for all runbooks in an automation account, not mix them. So I already have the one created. I'm going to go over to my automation accounts. This is a new automation account. One of the first things I'm going to do to prepare it for this script is go to Modules, and I need to add a couple. So I'm going to go to Browse Gallery, and AZ account is the first one. This is a prerequisite for all the other AZ modules. So I'll click Import and OK. Next, I'm going to search for AZ Compute. And click Import. Here you can see I'm getting an error that the prerequisite isn't met, AZ accounts. That's because it's not done importing yet. So I'm going to give it a minute and I'll come back. Okay, here I'm back at the list of modules. You can see my AZ account is now available. So I'm going to go back in and try to add that AZ compute. There it is. And I'll import. Next, I'm going to search for the Windows Virtual Desktop module. There it is. And I'll import. And click OK. While those are importing, I'm going to go back and add my credential object into this automation account. So here I'll go to credentials, and I'm going to add one. I'll give it a name, and this name is in the script. It's what the script calls. So if you change the name from what is in the script, make sure you update the script accordingly. The username is going to be the app ID. That's the application ID of the service principal used to deploy the Windows Virtual Desktop host pool. And again, if you haven't used a service principal to deploy a Windows Virtual Desktop, check out the video I have on it. And I'll add the password and click Create. Something else I did, and this is optional, is I added 2 encrypted variables. One is the Azure AD tenant ID, and the other one is the subscription ID. To be honest, I added these as encrypted variables, so I don't have to edit those strings in the video. You can add them here, though, if you want. All you have to do is add a variable, set it to encrypted, give it a name, and these names are called in the script. So if you change the names, you will need to update that in the script, and then add the value. Let's go back and check those modules. Yep, compute and accounts available, and Microsoft RD Infra, RD PowerShell. So we've got all the modules we need. I would suggest also to update the Azure module. If you go to this link, you'll get directions on how to create a runbook that will update your modules. The one thing to note is there's a variable for if you're using the Azure RM or the AZ modules. Make sure to update that to AZ for this automation account. Next, I'm going to create the runbook. And I'll create a new, and I'll call it Scale Host Pool. I'll set the type to PowerShell, and click Create. And then I'll paste the contents of that script into the body. I'm just going to save this quick because I forgot one thing. This is important to start and stop the session host. I go to my resource groups. I'm going to go to the resource group that my session hosts are in and go to access control and add a role assignment. What I'm doing here is giving the service principal contributor rights to this resource group. That way it has the permission to start and stop the VMs. And here is the service principal. I actually already set this for testing, so I'm going to discard it, but if you hit save, then your service principal will have the required rights to this resource group. Okay, let's go back to the automation account. I'm going to go back to my runbooks, and here it is. Let's open that up. I'm going to edit, and I'll just walk through this runbook real quick. So I've got some notes here in the comments. I have an error action default set. I don't think that's actually used, but it's set. It's kind of a habit I got into. I do have verbose logging, so it's set to silently continue, which won't do anything, but you can set it to continue if you wanted to see the output. Here's the server start threshold. This is the number of sessions that should always be running in this environment. That's a cushion for user logins between the run of the script. I have some peak time information here. First, you can do yes or no if you want to use it. There's a peak server start threshold. So again, that cushion that increases during peak hours. I've got the peak hour start time, the end time. So this would be 8 to 6. And then the UTC offset, as well as the days of the week that the peak will apply to. Here is my Azure tenant ID. And again, I'm using the get automation variable. I'm pulling that in, but if you wanted to, you could uncomment this line and just add it in here manually. Same with Azure subscription ID. Here's my session host resource group, my tenant name, and my host pool name. So you'll want to update all those accordingly. And I've got some functions. I'm going to come back to those. Here I have a try-catch block that grabs the credential object from Azure Automation, and then it adds the RDS account. So this is simply signing into the Windows Virtual Desktop environment. Next, it's going to get the host pool information. After that, it's going to verify that the host pool is set to depth first. If not, it'll write an error message and then exit. This chunk of code gets the date, converts it to the local time zone, and then creates a string based off the hour, minute, and second. That's later used as a comparison. I have more write verbose information. Again, that was just for testing primarily. I get the current day of the week. And then here's an if statement that checks to see if the current time is greater than start peak time or less than end peak time. It also checks to see if it's a peak day. And then last, if we're actually using peak. And if it's set to yes, then it's going to update the server start threshold with the value of the peak server start threshold. Next, it grabs the max session limit for the host pool and assigns that to a variable. Again, that's the max session limit that's assigned when the host pool is configured for depth first load balancing. The next chunk of code is going to get the session host, and the one thing that I'll point out, it excludes anything where allow new session is set to false. If a server is set to not accept new connections, it's probably in maintenance mode. Maybe it's waiting for patches or something. If it's in maintenance mode and there's no sessions on it, the script could potentially shut it down. And you probably wouldn't want that if you're trying to patch a server. And also because it won't accept new connections, we really can't count any of the spare capacity as valid spare capacity. So I decided I would just exclude those from the beginning. But keep in mind, if there are any session hosts in your environment that are set to not allow new connections, they will not be shut down automatically by the script. Here, this next block just simply takes a look at each of the session hosts and adds up all the sessions in the pool. Next, the script assigns all the session hosts that are available to a running session host variable, and then I get a count of that. And at the end, once the script has all that information, it calculates the session host target. So that's the number of servers that should be running. It takes the value of the current sessions and the server start threshold, adds those together, and divides it by the max session. And if there are any remainders, the math ceiling function here will just round it up to the next whole number. So now I have the number of servers that should be running and the number of servers that are running. So once I have that information, I can come down here and do some if statements. So if the running session host count is less than the session host target, meaning less session hosts are running than should be, I'm going to call the start session host function. If the running session host count is greater than the session host target, so there are more servers running than needed, it's going to call the stop session host function. And then if it's not greater than or less than, it's equal to, so everything is in harmony and it does nothing. Let's go back up to those functions now. This is the start session host function. So I'm passing in the list of session hosts. I'm going to find the session host with no heartbeat. Those would be shut down. If the number of session hosts with no heartbeat is 0, then I throw an error. And this is an error that actually, out of all this, I would say that is important. Because what that means is users are logging in, but there's no other server to start up. I have some content I added a while ago. One is to send an alert to Teams, and the other one was using SendGrid to send emails from within PowerShell. Either one of those would be a good option for this. But for this, I just added a write error. But if there are off session hosts, it's just going to select one of the session hosts. I've got the name here. Next, it's going to log into Azure with the credentials we already set up. The name that I get from Windows Virtual Desktop is the fully qualified domain name. I just need the actual host name, so it's splitting on the dot and grabbing the first value out of the array. So that's just this VM name. And then I'm running the start azvm command. And that should start the server. Next up is the stop session host. So again, we're passing in all of the session host information, and it's going to look for an empty session host. So that's a session host where the number of sessions equals 0 and its status is available. Now, if that is 0, meaning that there's no session host with 0 sessions on it, it's going to write an error and end. That will prevent servers with active sessions from getting shut down. So next, if there are session hosts with no sessions on them, it's going to grab one. Then it's going to log into Azure, and it's going to issue the stop azvm command. And that will shut down the server. So let's see if this works. I'm going to pull up VS Code quick. Here I'm in VS Code, and I've already signed into the Windows Virtual Desktop. And let's just take a look at our session host. Okay, so I have 3 of them, and there's no heartbeat, meaning that they're all turned off. So I'm going to run that script. Let's just run it and test. It's going to queue up, and it should run in a second. Now it's running. All right, that finished successfully. Let's go back to PowerShell and see what that looks like. All right, so I have 0 sessions, but now I have 1 server available. So why did it start that? Although I have 0 sessions, I do have the threshold set to 2. So if you go through that math, 0 plus 2 equals 2, and that's divided by, I believe the max session was 4 on this. These are small servers. So it comes out to be a fraction, but then it rounds up to 1. So the script will make sure that at least 1 server is running at all times. So if my threshold is set to 2, if I sign into 3 sessions, 1 other server should start. Let me try that. I'm actually logged in with 2. Let's see what happens with it just logged into 2 before I do a 3rd one. So I'm going to start again. Okay, that's done. Let me go back to PowerShell. Still, only 1 available. So let me log into a 3rd session. Now I'm logged in with a 3rd. Let's take a look at that. Still only 1 virtual machine running. Let me start this one more time. So the threshold was 2. There's 4 sessions allowed on each VM. The one has 3, meaning that it needs to start 1 more VM to meet that minimum of 2 available sessions. Okay, now it's finished. Let's go back to PowerShell. Okay, so now we have another server available. Just as it was intended to do, it saw that the threshold wasn't met. The number of session hosts that should be running didn't match the number running, so it started one. So now, why don't I log off from one and run it again to see if it'll shut down a server? I've logged out of 1 of the sessions. You can see there's 2 sessions left on the first server. So let me run the script one more time, and it should shut down the other one because there are 2 sessions available on the -0 server. I'll click Start again and wait for it to finish. That finished. Let's go back to PowerShell. And there it goes. So it automatically started and stopped a VM based on the user load. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to come out of editing, and I'm going to publish. So now that version's available as a runbook. Next step is I'll add a webhook. And a webhook is a URL. When ran, it will start the runbook. I'm going to use this as part of the Azure function that will trigger the runbook every 5 minutes. I'll just give it a name, Start Runbook. Want to make sure it's enabled and set the expiration time. I'm going to go out another year. And remember, when that expires, this will stop working. Next, I'm going to grab the URL, and I'm just going to paste it into Notepad quick. If you lose this URL, you'll have to create a new webhook. You only get 1 chance at saving this. So I'll click OK. And there are no run settings. I'll just click OK and create. So that created my webhook. Next, I'm going to create the Azure function. So I'll create a resource and create a function app. I'm going to select the same resource group that I used for Azure Automation. I'll give it a name. It's going to be code. And for the runtime stack, it will be PowerShell Core. And I'll leave it in Central US. I'm going to leave this all the same. I'm using a consumption plan. If you do have a PowerShell-based app service plan, you could run it in there as well. You don't have to create a new one if you already have this. I'm assuming some people won't have a function app running. Next is monitoring. Leave application inside as is. And I'm just going to go to review and create. And create. Okay, so that finished. Let me go to the resource. I'm going to add a function. And I'll go importal. And I'm going to set it for timer. And create. And if I go over to files, the first thing I'm going to do is go to the functions.json. So that just happens to be set for 5 minutes. There's a lot of documentation from Microsoft on the timer triggers function that will give you different expressions for different times, but that just happens to be 5 minutes, so that's good. Matter of fact, if you go to the README, it looks like they've included a link for cron expressions. But as I said, that should run every 5 minutes. So I'm going to go to run, and I'm going to get rid of everything except for that parameters. So I'm going to add an invoke web request. And then I need that URL that I copied previously. And then I need to add method equals post at the end. Okay, so we have invoke web request -URI, the URL that I copied from the webhook, and method post. So if I go to save and run, let's see what happens. You can check to make sure it's accepted right here. So it says it succeeded. I'm going to go back to the automation account. I'll go to my runbook. And you can see it completed. So that was just triggered. I'm going to hop back to the function. If I go to function apps, that's enabled, and it should run every 5 minutes. So I'll give it a few minutes. And while we're waiting, I'm going to log into a third session to see if it starts another VM. Okay, before it runs, let's just take a look at where we're at. So we have 3 sessions logged in, but only 1 server. The script is running. Okay, so that job completed. It does take a little bit longer when it starts or stops a VM. Let's go and take a look at the status. Here you can see now I have 2 available. So that ran just as we'd expect. It saw that the number of sessions was over the threshold, and it started another server. So now we have this Azure Automation Runbook triggered by an Azure function set on a timer. Now the great thing about this is it will run every 5 minutes, and if at least 1 server isn't running, it'll start it. This is a test lab, and I don't need 1 server running 24/7. So what I'm going to do, the one last step, is I'm going to go back to my function app. And if I go into functions at the top, I can disable this. So that's going to disable the timer trigger, so I can shut down my virtual machines until I come back to it later. I think that covers everything. Let's see here. We set the group policy. We created an Azure Automation account. We added those modules. Be sure to update your modules too if you use any other ones. Some of the modules that come by default with Azure Automation are pretty old. We added the service principal to rights to the resource group, published the runbook, got the webhook, tested that out, and then created an Azure function set to run every 5 minutes and trigger the runbook. I think that's it. That's it for the demo and the video. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you. Please subscribe, and if you found this helpful, click the thumbs up button. Thanks for watching.